Alisa, sorry, I was very fast in doing this. You see, I'm quick as lightning, guys. So, Alisa, thank you so much for accepting my invitation in Box One. Thanks for being with us today. It's a great pleasure. I'll let you introduce yourself to those who listen to us.
Great. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Alisa DiCaprio. I am the chief economist at R3, which is a blockchain platform company that started out as a consortium of 42 banks. And I came to R3 from Asian Development Bank, where I was working on trade finance and trade digitization. And before that, I had focused largely on doing different supply chain and international trade work in academia and with the UN.
Nice one, Alisa, and welcome to the space. It's BSA Europe Big Impact. This comes from an idea that Bob and I had a few weeks back in time, and after a few run-ups, now we run in this on a monthly base. So, Bob, leave the stage to you to start top discussion. We're eager to listen from you, Alisa, and to have your insights into what's going on in the space of digital trade and trade finance.
There's so much to talk about, and Elisa, probably you have also many topics. But of course, quite recently we had basically news on the liquidation of both trade lands. WeTrade was before, and actually last week I got surprised a little bit by Marco Polo, which was also actually an initiative that started at R3. How do you feel about that? What do you think is actually the problem that led to that liquidation of those initiatives?
Well, I would say it's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, we're all very disappointed in what is happening, but I think also a lot of this is getting ascribed to blockchain being a problem or trade being a problem. But I think in large part, a lot of this is about the business architecture around this and the investment environment, right? I mean, a lot of what I do now is I focus on the macro economy and how that affects DLT. So, what about the inflation environment or the employment environment is impacting what DLT projects are happening, what types of features they have. And certainly this is a case with many of those projects, is they were very dependent on investors and making sure that investors were going to continue their investments. I mean, these were startups, all of them. And that becomes a problem if your investors are facing a very difficult environment, which we've faced since COVID, and are not able to continue investment in the same degree that they were doing before. I can certainly talk about the individual projects if you'd like.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I mean, what we know is from WeTrade, the problem there was the business model. Because if you look at banks today, they largely don't fund SMEs. This was a lot of the work that I did when I was at Asian Development Bank, is we showed that banks simply do not give finance to small and medium-sized enterprises. Their applications are rejected more than anybody else. And the reason is it's not a hugely profitable sector for banks. Small and medium-sized enterprises don't do a lot of volume. They do relatively small trades compared to the large enterprises. And it's expensive to do KYC and to do AML on these transactions and go through compliance. So banks, in large part, are not as willing to fund SMEs as they would be for large enterprises. So what WeTrade did was they attempted to reduce the costs by moving everything to blockchain. And this was a great idea. But the problem is it didn't actually change the business model at all. What it did was take a process that was not working and put it on blockchain. And so unfortunately, the difference in costs, because of course this is a new startup, this is a startup, so there are costs associated with building the technology and implementing the technology, were simply not enough because it didn't increase volumes. So it was more efficient to work with your existing small and medium-sized enterprises, but there wasn't a big expansion of the population of small and medium-sized enterprises that were being worked with. Then with TradeLens, TradeLens was in huge demand. It had it focused on electronic bill of lading, which is of course a problem everywhere. And it was a terrific idea, but it was very difficult to expand the market because they had it was led by Maersk. And that fact meant that there were some other container shipping companies that would like to work with them and some that did not. So for example, we saw with most of the Chinese shippers, they formed their own group and were not interested in working with TradeLens. So you've immediately split the market. And so then they struggled to continue to expand that. So this is a governance issue. It's a network issue, not a technology issue.
Rings me a bell, Bob. What do you think? We touched on a few things about that. Sorry, Alisa, to go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would love to hear Bob's response.
Oh no, my first response is about retrade. I completely agree with you. I think it has to do a little bit. The problem is really the SMEs. It was a great solution. Thought of it. The technology could be beneficial in this way. It doesn't need to be specifically, but then how the ecosystem was created basically was maybe not the right player, so to say. If you would have other companies involved, which were more willing to take the risk or have an abundance of liquidity available and then providing it to the SMEs, it would have been easier because the banks normally are a little bit, what you mentioned before, doing it very difficult. They don't really help them so easily because of all the internal processes, the know your customer, anti-money laundering, etc. So it's a really regulated environment, which is very hard. Other players might have had benefits over there. So I think that is basically the biggest issue as well. So it partly could be the technology, but I think more how the ecosystem was formed and which participants were there. And I think with the banks, they had not had the right ones. If you think about TradeLens, I think it was great again, also as a business opportunity again, but then it was what I would call the openness. It was basically the operational processes for Maersk that they wanted to improve, but then how you access other players and give that openness and access to other players, that created the issue. So then you come talking about governance mainly again. So yeah, the different factors, the technology again was not really the issue, but it's more what is creating the whole ecosystem together and what cool rules you have related to the governance. I think those were the points with making it more difficult. So in that perspective, I totally agree with you. And it's something we touched upon in some of the previous talks as well. So it seems to be a reoccurring thought, which is nice that we're not the only ones thinking like that.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is that trade is inherently decentralized. Like the trade was never centralized, and it's very difficult to centralize it. But that also makes it difficult to put in place a technology which, although decentralization would be the outcome, you effectively need to start it with a central operator. Somebody needs to pay for it. So, where you see this being more effective is, for example, Contour. So Contour, what they did was, in order to start it in a centralized way, it worked with a consortium of banks. And so even though you had kind of a central business network operator, in fact, it was decentralized because you had this broader group of banks starting it. And so that makes it a little bit difficult in the Maersk case, where you really started with one technology company and one shipper, kind of pulling everybody along with them, which makes it a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, it's difficult to create then the critical mass to really adopt it, because they really saw it basically the same as Maersk. It was not a known brand, so to say. It was always related to either Maersk or IBM. Even Andrea mentioned it many times like that. And nobody talked about TradeLens, that it was a separate brand. And I think that also created a huge issue for them.
Oh yeah, that's actually, I hadn't thought about that, but that's exactly it. That's a great point.
I think you're on mute, Andrea.
I was agreeing with that. I mean, that was quite, I'm sorry, but I fear that there might be some noises. You see, I'm not alone in the house in this moment. So anyway, but I do agree with you. It was a little There was a problem linked to governance for most of the time, and a problem of branding. It was so encumbered one that maybe lost, I mean, get some space to the other one. So going on with what we are discussing, Alisa, we're talking about problem. We're talking about what might have caused this trouble and these failures, if we can call this way, demises. What can we do to solve this and to prevent these demises to happen in the future? Because we all know that we are heading towards digital trade and trade finance. And that is a fact because of all the job being done in the past, standards, solution, technical solutions, a market of technical infrastructures, all's being set up. This said, what can we do next to be successful? I mean, we'd love to have you take into this.
Well, I think, in terms of what we need to be successful in trade and supply chain from a technology perspective is really to show what the return on investment is for the projects that we have that are live. Because there's kind of two things that a project can do, right? The first is it can make an existing process more efficient. And the second is it can create new types of assets or new business flows that didn't exist in the absence of the technology. And I think since, getting back to the macro economy, since we've been in such a disruptive supply chain environment, it's been pretty challenging to focus on investment that's about making the process more efficient. We know that has to happen, but there's so much happening right now that businesses are just trying to stay together. They're just trying to make the supply chains work. They're not trying to make them different, or build new features into it, or maybe introduce a technology that would require some culture change and require have some disruption in the process. They're trying to reduce disruption as much as possible. And so I think this is a difficult environment already, and we have a difficult investment environment. So I think the focus right now, where I see businesses being successful, is where there's a clear vision of what the return on investment is. There is a clear focus on agility and flexibility in the platform. And there's a focus on performant platforms. So rather than building a lot of features, it's about making sure that the baseline platform works. It works well. It continues to work. And so basically what that means is a lot of the successful projects are the most basic. So it's less exciting, but I think it's more fundamentally transformative of the sector.
Want to be provocative, Alisa, not to be mean, not to be nasty. You mentioned transformation and new asset. First thing, what about new products? Because if you think about trade as a whole, this is laid on a massive bulk of products that have been here for centuries, last millennia. Think about the LC. It was created out of Middle Ages here in Tuscany to transport goods from a city to another one. It's 21st century. So it's been a while. Second thing, you can answer later on. We're talking, and this has been part of the discussion between me and BoB, and we agreed on a few things. We hear people talking massively about platform. What about ecosystems? Because in the end, trade is an ecosystem, if you think so. So my personal take is time's ripe for new products, indeed, that are much leaner, much seamless compared to the current, the one being in current use. And let's create ecosystem rather than platform as a whole. But I mean, I want to have you take into these 2 points. And BoB, if you feel, don't hesitate to add your perspective into this as well.
Well, first I'll give the opportunity to Alisa.
Let me dig the hole first.
Yeah, go first.
Well, I think, okay, so in terms of your contention that we need new products, I disagree with that a little. I think we need fewer products because a lot of these products are uh, sort of antiques. We sure we have a lot of products
I
that are
cannot agree more with you, Alisa. I cannot agree.
Yeah, so what I would like to see is more appropriate products. And I think we do see us moving in that direction because part of the reason we kind of just see the product space expanding rather than becoming more efficient is because the existing legal structure requires a lot of trade products to be paper-based, to be signed with physical signatures. Like these things are written, the laws are written around these requirements. And so you can create additional ones that don't quite follow those existing regulations, but that makes it even more difficult. So, one thing that I've seen that I think is really interesting, and I know this isn't what you asked about, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway, is what's happening with the redefinition of things like possession and control, because this is absolutely critical for what's happening in trade. If you're going to move into digitization, if you're going to move into digital assets, you need to have a legal definition that meets those assets. And so the UK Law Commission, for example, has come up with a definition of possession that doesn't require physical possession, which is how it was initially defined in law for hundreds of years.
Massive change, by the way. I heard Sarah Green from the Parliament discussing this, and she was really powerful in delivering this.
Yeah, she's terrific, and she's done amazing
Absolutely.
work on doing this. Yeah. The US as well, the Uniform Law Commission has looked at the concept of control and what does it mean to control an asset? Because historically, that was, again, a physical action related to possession, but you can't physically possess a digital asset, but you can control it. So they've also come up with some new guidelines. They've adjusted old guidelines. And so it's been a really exciting time, I think, in the legal space as they've created this space for digital assets. And I think that's really important when we talk about new products and what products are in the market.
So in that perspective, if I may respond to you, Alisa, I agree with you. We have too many products, especially very, very old ones. And it's all basically about control, because trade and those instruments or financial instruments basically are all about being in control of your goods or of your money. So there, the digital asset, where we just talked about, that creates some kind of possibility of ownership, that you know exactly what you own at what moment, and you have a clear transfer moment. I think that will help a lot. Together with the fact, I think with that you can create new products actually, which have these key elements in itself, the control over your goods as well as over the payment. And therefore you can have less financial instruments required to support basically trade. And therefore you do some kind of innovation in the product suite as well, as what Andrea was referring to. Because a lot of in the paperwork currently, which is there with signatures, etc., is just a manifestation that a certain event in the trade supply chain happened. It basically doesn't mean anything extra than that fact that it happened. So if you can actually prove that in another way, it will be very useful and beneficial. The same as like the digitization is very nice, but it's basically all about the data you require to be passed on to get a good understanding. What is the ownership and what is the status? As well as, is there certain information I require if I want to link the different supply chains, the financial and the logistics one, the physical one. So there's some interchange. So if you focus more on those and events in relation with it, I think we can make a huge difference there. Also thinking about completely new products. And that depends also a little bit again on how you also define a certain type of wording, because a digital platform, a platform, an ecosystem, are you talking about the same thing or different words? Are they bringing both value or is it different type of value? So actually, I don't know, what is your interpretation of platform and ecosystems, Alisa? How do you reflect on that?
Well, I think, taking off from something you said, One of the reasons that this is important to distinguish is because before there was legal recognition of a lot of the digital asset stuff that's happening, you had to have a rule book. So if you were a Contour or Marco Polo or a TradeLens or a WeTrade, you operated from a rule book because the existing rules did not allow you to do some of these processes in a fully electronic format. So the first thing is that by giving a legal structure to this, you no longer will need to have this rulebook format. And the rulebook format is what constrains your ecosystem. It constrains your ability to expand because everybody needs to sign it. And of course, if you've ever worked with lawyers, they will take an extremely long time to comment on the rulebook and try to make changes. And so this becomes...
I have no idea what you're talking about, seriously. That doesn't mean me a bell, Alisa. What are you talking about?
Always go smooth, eh?
Slow moving? No, I have no idea. I have no clue, actually. Seriously, I like this and I subscribe fully. Absolutely. Please go ahead. Didn't want to interrupt you.
No, but I think that gets to the... So this is the ecosystem. The ecosystem is your users. It's other banks, it's corporates. It really depends on the particular use case, but the ecosystem is the wider variety of entities that are interacting with your transaction over the course of its life cycle. The platform is simply the place where they're interacting, and which is the kind of business engine of whatever the process is that's happening. I think the fundamental difference here is the platform is often a single platform with interoperability layers, whereas the ecosystem has a variety of different platforms, a variety of other players that they're interacting with. And so it's much more diffuse than the concept of the platform, even if it's decentralized.
There is another factor, sorry, Alisa and Bob, that I was thinking of in my time. By the way, I've never worked for banks. I've been working for multinational company. And I was lucky enough to do that because company could afford paying for my own education into trade finance. So I was on the other side of the fence, but the relationship between me and the intermediary in my own transactions was pretty equal. So if any problem arises, I know how to prevent maybe any troubles to arise. We started talking about SMEs. They left behind in traditional instruments. Think about the common LC. Think about the bulk of legislation, the bulk of rules, the bulk of standards being under a single instrument, which is, again, it's a pretty old one. It's an old-fashioned, pretty cumbersome, can agree on that. Besides being capital intensive, because you have working capital being frozen literally, you can no longer use. So I was thinking, going digital can indeed step in as a major thing to set a relationship between several stakeholders in a seamless, equal way. You no longer have those gaps that might hinder transactions. Use multiless. I mean, this is my own idea, and I don't know how, if you, the two of you, I wanted to have your opinion to this. This sort of facilitates for transactions.
I think that's true, but I think we're in a particular moment right now in the trade ecosystem where, with the different platforms that we do have available, with the different DLT projects that we do have available, there still is a need to have kind of different levels of players. So for example, maybe you would need to have banks that are joining the platform, but you would expect the banks would bring their corporates. Or alternatively, the corporates join the platform and then they would need to bring their banks. So there still is these two levels, and it's not actually making them any more equal. They're still equal in their own transactions, but not in the platform. And I think, while we're in a period of change in trade, I think this won't change very quickly because there needs to be more of a culture change. And that's very, very difficult to propagate across countries, across sectors. I mean, this is something that's really hard to get done.
I think you touch upon a really good point, Alisa, in this case, because
Indeed.
like you said, you have the different players, they still have their own interests. And they can create certain type of partnerships, but they have to think about creating value for everybody. And that's still very difficult for many of them to actually think about. I think what might be the most beneficial thing happening around us currently is sustainability, because sustainability makes the larger players depend also on the information they gather from the smaller players inside their whole supply chain. So I think the corporates will start collaborating much more and thinking about the greater good in that perspective, because it will benefit from everybody. So then the smaller player can also benefit from all the benefits and the knowledge, the credit risk rating, you name it, from the larger ones. And the larger ones at one moment can persist actually of thinking of, like, for instance, a player as a bank to think differently also and help the smaller players in their supply chain. But I think it has to come from that type of thinking and that type of initiative, instead of that it will be between the corporate and the bank very quickly being arranged. I think you have to think more first about all the players in the supply chain, which then help, for instance, to think differently with the help of the support of a bank.
I agree, and I think it's also a function of liquidity, right? If you're an SME, you don't have a lot of extra liquidity, and you also don't have a lot of extra time, and you probably don't have a very well diversified management structure with somebody who is going to be responsible for changing your platform. So to that extent, I agree with you, but I think it's also important to remember SMEs today have developed in the digital economy. They didn't develop before the digital economy started. I mean, except for those SMEs that have been around for like decades and decades, but most of them are more familiar than large companies with this stuff. So I wouldn't discount their ability to be natively digital in a way that we wouldn't expect from larger companies that have this historical sort of relationship structure and management structure.
That's also a good point in that perspective. They're probably much more adaptive also to new technology. However, they're still being bothered by all the rules and regulations, which are still so old-fashioned. And actually, the larger ones have the larger problem to adapt to new technology, because they have all these processes in place, which they've been working on for years and years and years. And to have change that might be extremely difficult. So I think that is a fair point.
In support of what you were saying, though, when I first joined R3, we were doing pilots, and we were looking for corporates to do pilots with, and there was this focus on working with big corporates. And I remember I came in, having come from Asian Development Bank, working with small, medium-sized enterprises. And I said, why aren't we working with SMEs? I mean, if that's the goal, is to increase financial inclusion and to, bring them up in the supply chain, shouldn't we be piloting with them? And it was explained to me, and this makes perfect sense, that we're talking about a frontier technology. So if something goes wrong in this pilot transaction, and it went wrong, and your pilot transaction is with a large corporate like Walmart, or it doesn't matter. They can write it off, they can move things around, it just doesn't matter. But if something goes wrong in a pilot transaction with a small and medium-sized enterprise, that might be the only transaction they're doing that month, and so it could potentially tip them over. And so I thought that this kind of gets to your point. The large corporates need to lead the sector, but the large corporates right now are not really doing that. And so, where does that leave us in terms of moving forward in trade and supply chain?
Why do you think large corporate are not stepping in as prime movers? Kind of should be their own concern to start a movement on. Looks like they're hindering this shift towards digitalization.
Well, I mean, in my experience, they're moving forward with internal use cases, and particularly financial use cases. Absolutely, that is happening. But in terms of building wider supply chain use cases, it's just become so difficult in the current environment that I just don't see as much movement as we saw 3 years ago or before COVID. I mean, that was really, I think COVID was really the breaking point, where the focus now is on finance, absolutely, internal processes, absolutely, but not this wider, like, let's put a global supply chain and see if we can make that work because of all of the macroeconomic problems that we have today. Do you disagree?
Not at all. No, I totally agree with you. Absolutely.
Is it also due to the fact they start thinking differently about the supply chains and you hear all these words of nearshoring, etc. again? Is that also playing a role, you think, then?
I would imagine. Andrea, what do you think?
No particular idea into this, to be honest, Lisa. I'm still observing. I'm still at the window trying to understand what my coast is. But I was thinking out loud, you see, to expand discussion into this. We're talking a lot when we stepped in as an association in raising awareness on these topics. Governance, we're talking about governance, we're talking about digitalization. How can such initiatives can bring discussion and activity further on and avoid people to incur in the same demises that we were discussing earlier? I mean, how can this activity, this bulk activity, being done not only by us, it's just a small entity, but even by a larger entity, carry on to good results, bring on to good results, to go further?
I think that the question is of how do you make trade move faster in digitization is a very interesting one, because you're talking about a hugely complex sector. Maybe what would work is using the example of the financial sector, because that's where we've seen a lot of this stuff moving very quickly. And what's mattered for the financial sector is starting with very limited trade corridors and partners. So you don't start with the entire supply chain. You start with a very, very small piece of it, and you make that work really well, and then you expand it. We've also seen a bigger focus from infrastructure players rather than the retail players. And so the way that this would translate into supply chain would be, kind of using, and this I think we're seeing, is where, trade infrastructure is actually using DLT to make the processes more efficient. And then that will, in theory, continue to push the sector forward. And then I guess the third thing that we see in the financial sector is that an increasing involvement of regulators themselves, not in terms of making regulations, but here I'm talking about central bank digital currencies, where the regulators are actually issuing assets based on blockchain. And so with trade, that's more difficult because there isn't really one trade regulator. The WTO is kind of the closest thing that we have.
So many in the large picture. That's why it's so complicated world, such a complicated space. It's granular. There's so many in the picture.
But isn't that an excuse? I feel like we've been making this excuse for the trade sector forever.
Would you, if you asking, yes, we are straight in the face, but we have to be honest in the space. Since the beginning, we know this is an excuse, Alisa. We no longer have excuses. You see, the king is naked, as we say in this part of the world now. So no more excuses. They don't serve the cause, basically. We have many regulators, we have many legislation, we have many. Okay, cool. Man went on the moon. We can't solve this out. So if you're asking me, yes, we do have, and we do have to overcome this attitude This is my 2 cents. I mean, personal opinion, very personal opinion. But we have to be frank. We have to be honest in delivering. Sorry, Alisa,
Fully-
you can.
If I put my 2 cents, I fully agree with it. We make it ourselves extremely difficult, and it's basically an excuse, because if you look at money transfer, there's so many opportunities out there. It's not just banks anymore. Logistics, they have been changing as
Same.
well, as you mentioned. Healthcare, you see the same things
Same as
extremely
before.
happening there. They're also heavily regulated, but it's happening there.
It's
Maybe
happening. So it should happen in trade.
but it's still more of a, compared
Cor-
in a regional perspective than trade, because it's very, very international. But yeah, you can solve it
Absolutely.
also with the customs which are involved. You have trade regulations. You can start making partnerships, basically set the rules of the governance for related to it, and you can move on. It doesn't have to be that difficult, but I think we make it ourselves very difficult, because it's so nice to think about the traditional way. Why change? Because change is scary.
Alisa, I wanted to bring discussion a step further and seen under the perspective of businessmen, entrepreneurs, talking about these topics, we're touching on this discussion, how and what can such debates bring in terms of benefits to businessmen, entrepreneurs, and going further in their own ventures? This is my big question for you now.
So how can the potential benefits of the discussions we're having in trade trickle down to the actual businesses? Well, I mean, I think, coming out of the blockchain space, we have never worked with a client that didn't see some sort of return on investment from their work on blockchain. They weren't, well, let me take that back. When I first started working at R3, nobody wanted to talk about blockchain. They were uninterested. I spent most of my time trying to get meetings with people and like convince them that they should think about blockchain.
Talking about.
I mean, it was, but then just maybe 2 years later, I was receiving calls from everybody that they were just like, we want to use blockchain. And I said, well, what do you want to use it for? I don't know, but my boss told me we should have blockchain something. So what can I blockchain? And so then for that, during that period of time, it was a lot of pushing back on companies saying like, that is not a use case for blockchain. That's just a use case for like digitization or whatever. You don't actually need this brand new technology. You can solve that already. And so today we're in this a situation where the use cases that come to us are generally more carefully thought out, where the solution really is decentralization can do something that nothing else can do, or the previous technologies are too expensive to do, or don't do particularly well. So that I think is a progression that's been very important, because you do see the business side of this understanding a lot more clearly now what blockchain is, what decentralization can do and can't do. And finally, kind of getting back to the regulatory point on this, which is pretty important. There's one regulatory development that I've seen in the past maybe 6 to 8 months that has been pretty critical for the future of DLT and blockchain. And that's regulators restricting the use of cryptocurrencies to the extent that they can. They're just making it much more difficult to trade them, to hold them, capital requirements. And at the same time, regulators being much more permissive about digital assets. So you have the ESMA DLT pilot regime, you have the regulatory sandbox in the UK, where regulators are saying, we want you to use digital assets. We want to help you figure out how to do that, help us understand what rules need to be changed or adjusted. And this trend, I think, is really moving blockchain into an infrastructure space.
Oh, Bob is back. This is very interesting stuff, Lisa. We're talking about digital objects, digital assets. We talked about possession. We talked about control over these objects because it's a primary subject in trade. What about ownership? And how important it is to understand this basic concept of ownership of digital objects and assets when it comes to successful projects of venture?
Well, that I think is one of the biggest difficulties of blockchain in trade and supply chain, is because trade and supply chain is inherently physical. You're trading physical goods. I can hold them. I'm going to put them on a ship, because putting something on a ship is never the most efficient way to do it if it's digital, right? So you're talking about physical things. With blockchain, all of this is digital. So all of the, putting documents on a plane to like fly it over to the bank in India, so the documents can be checked up against the documents of that bank. You don't have to do that with DLT. And so the question of ownership is, how much can you transfer this physical process to a digital process? And how can you make sure that the digital process matches what's happening on the physical side? Because, I mean, if you look at bills of lading, that's exactly what's happening, right? I mean, so you ship goods from one country to another, and the bills of lading also have to go from one country to another. And this is not hugely efficient, but because the way that we've defined it is that you have to have a physical document, the physical document is paper. That's what happens. So I think it's really like the physical digital divide continues to be a big problem, a big frustration in trade.
Do you think then that the current news interactions with people with the metaverse, Web3, etc., is going to help in that perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what we're seeing there is, to Andrea's point, a changing perspective of what it means to own something. Because I can own a piece of digital art. I can own something in the metaverse. I can track my participation in a particular song that's now being monetized in different areas. So I think the fact that it allows us to have a more expansive definition of ownership is really exciting, and certainly something that's affecting trade. I mean,
you just anticipated my next question: how to define effectively ownership into a trade-based scenario, Alisa. The efficient way, not to as we say, to complicate the bread, as we say here in Italy. So we have to make it simple and effective as possible.
Well, I think, I mean, if you look at the WTO already has TRIPS, so rules on intellectual property. They have TRIMS, rules on investment measures. They have rules on services. So it's, when you think about trade rules, it's not just rules about goods. It's rules about all of the parts of trade. So I think this kind of is a relatively natural progression, right, into the WTO. Started as GATT. It was only goods. It was trade in goods, period. And now, as the WTO, it's all of these other types of agreements. And so moving this into dematerialized goods, or natively digital goods, however you want to call it, I think is a natural next step.
Do you see also an important role for the DWO there, or are there organizations which can actually support that?
I mean, the WTO has many problems. So I think certainly it's the natural first step, because people think about it as the closest thing we have to a trade regulator. But certainly there's other organizations, the WCO, the World Customs Organization, for example, the International Chamber of Commerce, all of these, they're not regulators exactly, but they do cover an important part of the trade process, and certainly all of them are involved in this as well.
but still more intense collaboration is very beneficial, should be beneficial to make the difference.
It should be,
Hopefully.
but most of what we see from a lot of these larger organizations like the WTO are research reports, which is fine, but it gets to the critique of how do you move this into actual business processes.
Yeah, research can do many things, but I would go on the more imperative side, you see, and collaboration is indeed a game changer. So, I mean, those large entities, again, this is my 2 cents, should start talking to each other more often, more efficiently, and get their own hands down to the job.
I mean, I'm a researcher. I love research, but I also understand that from a supply chain perspective, you need the business involved, and that's where we need to get to.
That's a pretty practical supply chain and trade finance. I mean, it has very practical aspects. So everything starts from research. Think about what we discussed earlier. New products being into the stage takes a lot of research into that. But in the end of the day, get hands down and make things happen. Just wondering now, Alisa, just as we heading towards maybe the end of this discussion, I would love this to last for hours and hours, but I guess we roll pretty slant at the moment. We started from the demise, failures, let's call them so. Would love to hear your opinion according to your experience, what is the right way to start a project or a venture into trade finance, digital trade finance, digital supply chain / finance?
Well, I think so. First of all, I'm going to take some issue with the failures comment, because I feel like, I mean, in any sector, in any trade corridor, some projects work and some projects don't, and all of them are learning experiences, and I think all of them are extremely critical to like understanding where we're going. So even though some of the difficulties with DLT projects and trade finance haven't turned out the way that we'd hoped, we learned from all of them. And what that's doing is it's making the projects that continue to exist and continue to be profitable stronger and more resilient. And I think, from coming out of trade and supply chain, we know how important resilience is. And so I think we're actually learning a lot from them, and it's been good. Back to your actual question, which is, what's the right way to do a project? Trade finance is fascinating because it was one of the first movers in blockchain. I mean, that's really where you saw DLT see its earliest successes. And certainly that is an area no one expected, because trade finance, let's face it, is not really sexy. I mean, I think it's fascinating and very interesting and obviously extremely important for global trade, but you want to talk about global supply chains and what's happening there. You don't really want to talk about banks checking documents.
And I think it's quite again sexy, that activity. It's that contrary.
But I think what it set the stage for was banks checking documents. If you can make those documents electronic, you can make the process more efficient, you can make it quicker, reduce your cost of capital. These things are all absolutely critical for the trade process. And so I think where we've gotten to in trade finance is that we have some projects that work, and there is almost no bank that has not or is not seriously considering this technology as part of their financial infrastructure. And so I think that's where this has gone, where you don't hear about DLT a lot, but it's being used. And I think that is probably the most important thing that could have happened. No client is going to go to their bank and say, "Are you using blockchain?" They don't care. They want to know if the product works, if the bank offers the product that they want, and if it's at a reasonable cost. And so that's where blockchain has really changed what we're seeing in trade finance, but in a way that people don't quite notice, which is exactly the goal.
I want to be provocative again, Lisa. But being provocative sometimes helps some interesting topics to rise to the surface. Whenever a new technology, if we can call blockchain and DLTs a new technology, comes under the spotlight, you hear people, hey, this innovation will cut labor, will cut job posts. So you're hindering individual, you're hindering humanity. We have to fight against this because we know internally that this is not putting people out of their job. It's rather enhancing job the digital way. And that brings back to educational side of things. You have to get feed for doing this. Wanted to hear this. I mean, you might have heard for sure you say, and in this, it's not only blockchain, it's also artificial intelligence, machine learning for checking documents, interacting, by the way, with digital assets and blockchain in the middle. So, I mean, we also have to fight against this mental attitude by the stakeholders involved. They have fear of losing their position, of losing the revenues, maybe.
Okay, so I think the employment perspective is interesting. I have maybe three different responses to that. The first response is one that I learned very early when I was working at ADB, and I was doing a lot of work with customs officials about digitizing customs documents. And I can tell you with certainty that there is not a single customs official that has ever wished that we went back to paper, that has ever kind of said, remember those days when we processed documents in quadruplicate, color coded? Wasn't that
Well,
great?
we had those beautiful sheets of paper, those nice stamps, so colorful, they will be so beautiful. Oh, I miss them. I don't think so.
I think, yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's the first thing is nobody likes checking documents. Nobody likes using paper. It's not that there is a contingent of people that feels like great value in this. The second point is that, especially for trade finance, this is incredibly important. And this gets to the point where I kind of made fun of it a little bit, and I said, well, nobody thinks it's that great. Well, one of the problems that we have in trade finance is attracting new people, because if you are this sector that is historically thought of as, pretty slow moving, not very innovative, you're not going to be able to attract new people. And so part of the benefits of using DLT is you can make it really exciting for new people to come into the sector. You can get new graduates from great programs that want to work in your bank. And I think that is certainly something that we've seen.
And I heard, by the way, sorry for interrupting you, you can go ahead, Alisa. I heard people working in bank claiming, hey, we can no longer find people that are fit enough to check documents. Welcome to the new world. We knew how that works. And that generation is going to retire. Some of them, they passed away. So you didn't get the soil ready for bringing on new generation into the space. And that's what technology can play a defining role, absolutely. Technology doesn't get retired, doesn't pass away, absolutely, especially if you do upgrade, if you do update technology and you follow the current role. Sorry for interrupting you, Alisa. You can go ahead with what you were saying.
No, I mean, I think it's a great point. I mean, you want to attract people, you have to make it attractive to what they know and what they want to be doing. They want to be part of something exciting, and new technology is that. And the final point around employment in the sector is really around the new services that you're creating. So yes, there's going to be some jobs that are no longer required, but also, I mean, R3 as a company wouldn't exist without blockchain. So we have an entire company that now exists and employs people to do this. And plenty of people that we employ came from banks. because we need their knowledge and they need our knowledge. So, I think, and particularly now we're in a period of intensely high turnover in the financial and technology space. So there is a lot of moving around. So I think it's important to say, yes, there will be some areas of the bank that will change, but other areas that will grow much larger.
And it's not only in banks, it's also happening in the corporates themselves related to supply chain management. The insights of data help also the corporates much more. The corporates think like, okay, this is actually great because we can actually focus on our clients instead of doing all those things and calling just to find out where my goods are or something like that. Because I think that is also the main issue. It feels like there's a threat to a certain type of work, but in the end, it's work which is not really bringing much value. And actually, you want to do the best for your clients from any perspective, from a bank's perspective, from a corporate, etc. You want to give the best value, the best service. And if you have the tweaks to do that, I think that is always beneficial.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it gives them more time to focus on the business, not the admin.
Exactly.
I love that. Yeah.
Exactly.
To focus on where the real value added is, actually focus on the business, focus on the value, on the real value, instead of, getting lost on those antics, as we call it at the start.
It's all about solving the jobs to be done.
What's that?
It's all about solving the jobs to be done, solving the difficult part.
Exactly.
How can you make it easier for everybody?
Bob, would you like to add any insights to what we were discussing? Would you like to
I think it was very informative and interesting to hear the thoughts of Alisa on it, because we started with call it failures or problems from the past, but basically that's not the case. It's all about learning and experimenting and get the best insights of it to actually do things much better in the future. We also know about all the new changes in rules and regulations, and the definition of ownership is going to change, and therefore that has a huge impact on supply chains and on trade finance itself. I think it's a really great development, and I think you see that happening, that there's much more interest in helping each other or still collaborating. Although currently the focus might be still very much looking at yourself, but I think that will change quite quickly also when things are running smoothly from a macroeconomic perspective, as you also mentioned, Alisa. So I think it was a very interesting talk. So I want to thank you for that at least. And I have nothing else to add, but maybe you still have a question, Andrea.
No, that was don't want to be abruptive to cut short, I'm sorry. But that was I don't want to profit of your time too much, Alisa. This was very, very interesting session that we had. Perfect follow-up to the former ones. And I can do nothing but thanking you so much and inviting you to step in furthermore in the future if you're willing to, if you wish to, of course. As we said at the start of the meeting, we actually aiming at making a big impact, as big as possible. So we do need opinion and insight of people, valuable insights of people that are deeply devoted to the industry modernization. So my biggest thanks to you for joining us today, and can't wait continue talking to you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was a wide-ranging discussion. I very much enjoyed it.
Perfect. So see you soon. And thanks for joining us. Bob, thanks. Would you like to add anything else at the end?
No, I want to thank everybody again for watching us. I want to thank especially to Alisa for bringing her insights. And please, if you have any other question or topic you would like to get more information or insights on, please put it in the comments and let us know.
Perfect.